Commissar Vrakesh executed Lieutenant Helm at 0847 hours for defeatist sentiment expressed in front of 11 soldiers. By 0900, 14 volunteers presented themselves for a suicide mission requiring only 6. The correlation is not coincidental. Fear has tactical applications that no quantity of propaganda posters, devotional literature, or inspiring addresses from regimental command can replicate in the acute compliance crisis. This report documents those applications systematically. Morale is not a feeling. It is a measurable variable. This report measures it. The Imperial Guard fields between 500 million and untold trillions of soldiers across the breadth of the Imperium at any given moment. The Administratum cannot confirm the precise figure. What is confirmed is this: the majority of those soldiers are not volunteers in any meaningful doctrinal sense. They are conscripts, crest levies, indentured regimental obligations, and tithe fulfillments drawn from worlds that had no option to decline. Their motivation to fight is not intrinsic to their person. It must be installed, maintained, and periodically recalibrated by authorized political officers. This is the foundational political problem that has defined imperial military doctrine across 10,000 years of continuous warfare. How do you compel a human being, stripped from their homeworld, inadequately equipped relative to most enemies they will face, poorly fed by munitorum standards that themselves represent a generous interpretation of minimum survival requirements, to advance against enemies of genuinely nightmarish capability? The Imperium arrived at an answer that is both simple and comprehensively effective. You make retreat more immediately lethal than advance. The Commissariat exists as the institutional embodiment of this philosophy. Political officers are embedded at every level of Imperial Guard structure, from regimental command down to individual squad assignments in the most ideologically vulnerable units. They serve one primary documented function in Commissariat operational doctrine. They ensure that the fear of the Commissar exceeds the fear of the enemy. When this equation is properly calibrated and maintained, compliance is absolute and measurable. When calibration fails, intervention is required. This report documents the intervention protocols and their outcomes. Political Officer Report 447 Gamma, filed following the Cadian 8th's deployment at Kasserveth during early Chaos incursion operations, frames the initial compliance challenge in measurable terms. Pre-engagement morale assessment, 71% acceptable, 22% concerning, 7% critical. The concerning and critical categories represent soldiers for whom the enemy has become the primary fear architecture. These individuals represent an active compliance liability. Left unaddressed, defeatist sentiment propagates laterally through unit structures with exponential acceleration once it crosses the 25% threshold within any given platoon formation. The Commissariat's institutional response to this compliance problem developed across centuries of documented battlefield observation and systematic ideological refinement. Early Commissariat doctrine, preserved in the Tactica Imperialis Addenda under Political Operations Supplement 7, emphasized inspiration as the primary morale tool. Commissars were expected to lead from forward positions, demonstrate the Emperor's favor through conspicuous personal courage, and serve as living evidence that faith provided material protection. This approach achieved measurable compliance improvements under specific operational conditions. It also demonstrated measurable limitations that revised doctrine sought to address. Comparative analysis of regimental performance data from the early Macharian Crusade against late campaign records reveals a significant divergence in commissar methodology that correlates with compliance outcome improvements. Early Crusade political officers favored inspirational methodology. Summary execution rates were documented at approximately 0.3 correctional executions per 1,000 soldiers per engagement. Late Crusade commissars, having observed and recorded the limitations of inspiration under sustained high-casualty conditions, shifted systematically toward fear calibration methodology. Execution rates rose to a documented 2.1 per 1,000 soldiers per engagement. Desertion rates fell by 67% over the same comparative period. The compliance data supported doctrinal revision, and the revision was enacted. The key ideological insight embedded in this doctrinal shift was fundamental to what became modern commissariat compliance theory. Inspiration functions effectively under conditions of manageable operational stress. When soldiers believe the mission is achievable, elevating their commitment to that belief yields measurable morale improvement. When soldiers conclude the mission is not achievable, when casualty rates are catastrophic, when resupply has failed, when the enemy visibly exceeds anything they were psychologically prepared to face, inspiration loses its morale coefficient entirely. The soldier's cognitive process arrives at a conclusion that even genuine belief cannot override. The inspired fighter and the despairing fighter both die in this engagement. Fear, however, functions independently of environmental conditions. A soldier confronting a tyrannid bioform of significant scale knows, rationally, that it can kill them. A soldier who has witnessed a summary execution knows, with absolute certainty, that retreating also kills them. The distinction between these two fear sources is operationally critical. The bioform represents probabilistic death. Many soldiers in comparable situations survive engagements against even formidable tyrannid organisms. The Commissar's bolt pistol represents certain and immediate death. Summary executions do not miss, do not relent, and are not subject to the tactical variables that make enemy action survivable. The commissariat doctrine is explicit. Certain and immediate consequences modify behavior more reliably than probable and deferred consequences. Tactical necessity observation. The choice the commissariat presents to a soldier is never between fear and comfort. It is between two fears. Controlled fear directed at the commissar and therefore manageable through compliance, versus uncontrolled fear directed at the enemy and therefore dangerous to unit cohesion and operational function. The political officer's documented function is redirection. Fear is not eliminated in the Imperial Guard. It is weaponized against the enemy by being first directed at the commissar. This is not cruelty. It is the most efficient deployment of an available psychological resource. The documented operational record supporting fear calibration doctrine is extensive and spans multiple theaters. Commissar Jürgen Haas of the Valhallan 597th, deployed during the Second Siege of Nusquam Fundamentibus, faced a regiment whose morale coefficient had collapsed to 2.1, well below the 4.0 minimum operational threshold, following 3 weeks of sustained Chaos Space Marine engagement. Inspirational methodology had been attempted and measured. No statistically significant morale improvement recorded over a 48-hour trial period. Haas executed 2 sergeants and 1 junior officer for defeatist sentiment propagation over a subsequent 72-hour period. Documented morale coefficient recovery 2.1 to 5.8. The regiment held its assigned defensive position for an additional 40 days. The Catachan jungle fighters present a recognized ideological complication that commissariat training documentation explicitly addresses. Their regimental culture produces soldiers with exceptionally elevated baseline fighting spirit. Fanaticism index ratings average 7.3 compared to the Guard-wide average of 4.8. Their political reliability, however, presents consistent oversight challenges. Catachans exhibit resistance to commissariat authority at rates 6 times the Guard-wide average. Multiple political officers embedded in Catachan regiments have met with accidents of operationally suspicious character. Political officers assigned to these regiments must modify fear calibration approach while maintaining the doctrine's underlying compliance function. Morale Comparison Study Alpha. Kataken jungle regiments with aggressive commissariat presence documented 23% higher desertion rates than those with moderate presence during multi-month campaigns. Kataken regiments with no commissariat presence documented 41% higher unauthorized tactical retreats, but 71% lower official desertion. The compliance mechanism differs. Katachans maintain combat function through unit loyalty rather than commissar fear, but the behavioral outcome, soldiers remaining at their positions under fire, is functionally equivalent for operational purposes. Political reliability assessment. Acceptable performance, requiring monitoring. The loyalty quotient exists. Its source is ideologically non-standard. Its function is currently sufficient. Understanding when fear calibration is required demands systematic diagnosis of morale collapse indicators before applying correctional action. The political officer who intervenes too early wastes a compliance resource. Exemplary punishment deployed before soldiers understand its ideological context generates resentment rather than compliance adjustment. The political officer who intervenes too late allows defeatist sentiment to metastasize beyond containment through individual action alone. Timing is the disciplined application of observation and assessment. This section documents the 4 most frequently encountered collapse indicators in operational field deployments. Indicator 1 is vocal defeatism. This represents the most straightforward and immediately actionable trigger in commissariat intervention doctrine. A soldier expressing doubt about mission outcome, command capability, or the Emperor's protection in a manner audible to other soldiers represents an active and propagating morale liability requiring immediate assessment and response. The content of the expressed doubt is operationally irrelevant to the intervention decision. A soldier expressing reasonable tactical concerns about genuine ammunition shortages is as dangerous to unit cohesion as one expressing pure cowardice, because the morale coefficient impact on surrounding soldiers is functionally identical. Intervention threshold. Immediate documentation and commissar response. Ideological analysis observation. Private doubt is inevitable in any soldier who has witnessed comrades die in service to the Emperor's will. This is a biological trauma response, not a deliberate political choice. The Commissariat does not attempt to eliminate private doubt from the minds of individual soldiers. This exceeds the Commissariat's operational scope and its practical capability. What political officers enforce is the absolute boundary between private doubt and its public expression. That boundary, maintained through consistent observation and correction across the full regimental structure, is the operational definition of loyalty in Imperial Guard service. Indicator 2 is behavioral withdrawal. Soldiers who have experienced morale collapse below critical threshold frequently exhibit behavioral indicators before vocal defeatism emerges and becomes propagating. These documented indicators include reduced voluntary communication with unit members, refusal of additional rations offered at meal distribution. A reliable diagnostic has soldiers suppressing fight or flight responses lose appetite in patterns distinct from genuine food scarcity conditions. Increased letter-writing activity directed toward family and systematic avoidance of eye contact with authority figures during routine inspections and formation. Political officers trained in behavioral assessment identify pre-vocal defeatism with approximately 73% accuracy through these indicators alone. The operational value of early identification through behavioral assessment is straightforward. A soldier exhibiting withdrawal behaviors who is addressed through ideological re-education protocols before vocal defeatism emerges consumes fewer compliance resources. The regiment retains a trained fighter who has not yet contaminated surrounding unit members while achieving comparable compliance restoration outcomes to post-vocal intervention. Commissariat Directive 34 Beta ideological re-education protocols include reassignment to high-visibility duties that create artificial investment in mission success outcomes, public acknowledgement of the soldier's prior service record to activate pride compliance mechanisms, and structured exposure to propaganda materials calibrated to their specific category of doubt. Measured effectiveness: 61% compliance restoration within 48 hours of protocol initiation. Indicator 3 is peer loyalty overriding institutional loyalty. This presents diagnostically as soldiers covering for absent comrades during accountability checks, failing to report defeatist statements made within their unit, or actively providing misleading information to political officers during compliance assessments. Squad-level interpersonal bonds represent among the most powerful morale factors in Imperial Guard operational psychology. They are also, when directed against commissariat authority rather than toward the enemy, among the most dangerous compliance liabilities in an extended campaign. A squad that protects one defeatist soldier from political officer assessment has effectively protected the concept of defeatism. The loyalty coefficient that makes squads function effectively in combat can make them collectively resistant to compliance enforcement when improperly calibrated. The Commissariat Intervention Protocol for this specific indicator is more complex than simple exemplary punishment. A political officer who executes a popular soldier for triggering peer protection behaviors risks activating collective resentment that further degrades institutional loyalty ratings. Commissariat doctrine recommends a staged protocol. First, identify and extract the primary defeatist before peer protection behaviors can activate. Second, address the squad collectively through formal commissar address, emphasizing that protection of treasonous thought constitutes ideological complicity under Directive 44 Kappa. Third, assess whether individual squad members require additional compliance action. The objective is disrupting the protective network structure before punishing the individual it attempted to shield. Morale measurement observation. Unit cohesion rated 7.2 pre-campaign for the Vostroyan Firstborn's 14th Regiment, drawn from engagement records during the Sabbat World's Crusade operations. Post-sustained casualty assessment following 3 major engagements, 3.8. The drop below the critical 4.0 threshold indicates an active morale crisis requiring immediate intervention. 3 targeted commissar actions over 48 hours, 2 correctional conversations with individual soldiers, 1 summary execution of a vocal propagator, restored the cohesion rating to 6.1. Intervention below the 4.0 threshold consistently requires escalation to summary justice. Correctional conversation protocols alone demonstrate measured effectiveness only above the 5.5 cohesion threshold. Indicator 4 is failure of propaganda reception. Political officers conducting regular propaganda effectiveness assessments, weekly minimum recommended during active engagements, measure reception through behavioral indicators rather than self-reported belief data. Soldiers instructed to report their own ideological compliance will report compliance, because reporting otherwise carries obvious and immediate consequences. Behavioral measurement provides more accurate effectiveness data. Voluntary participation rates for hazardous duty assignments. Communal prayer frequency during stand-down periods. Response latency to formation orders, and the emotional content quality of pre-battle vocalizations during address. When propaganda reception falls below measurable behavioral thresholds, ideological re-education alone is insufficient to restore compliance. The failure of propaganda reception indicates that the gap between the promise of imperial truth and the operational reality soldiers are experiencing has grown too large for messaging to bridge through belief reinforcement alone. This is the compliance threshold where commissar authority becomes essential as the primary morale restoration tool. Propaganda promises protection, victory, and the emperor's favor. If none of these has materialized in observable terms across multiple engagements, soldiers know rationally that the propaganda's factual claims are not accurate. They comply with its behavioral requirements anyway, maintaining formation, advancing on command, performing their duties, not because they believe the content, but because the consequences of non-compliance are immediate and beyond doubt. Fear rehabilitates what propaganda alone cannot sustain. Morale Comparison Study Beta. Propaganda effectiveness tracking conducted across Armageddon Steel Legion units during the Third War for Armageddon documents instructive compliance data. Steel Legion units receiving daily propaganda reinforcement, distributed posters, scheduled Vox broadcasts, regular devotional literature distribution, maintained behavioral compliance rates of 87% through months 6 through 9 of the campaign. Units receiving propaganda only at weekly intervals maintained 79% compliance through the same period. Units receiving only commissar presence with no propaganda program maintained 81% compliance. Conclusion: propaganda and fear calibration are not equivalent compliance mechanisms, but they are interchangeable to a limited degree. Propaganda is more resource efficient for sustained compliance maintenance across extended deployment. Fear calibration is more reliably effective during acute compliance crises where messaging cannot reach. Optimal morale management architecture combines both in proportions calibrated to campaign duration and operational intensity. The ideological implications of Armageddon's compliance data deserve specific documentation. The Steel Legion faced an enemy, Orc forces under warlord Gazkul Ma Guruk Thraka, whose physical scale, aggregate noise profile, and apparent collective immunity to conventional fear created what Commissariat Field Assessment classifies as a fear inversion crisis in affected Guard units. Soldiers who witnessed Orc charges at close range reported the enemy's apparent fearlessness as acutely undermining their own morale coefficient in ways that standard fear inversion propaganda failed to correct. What ultimately stabilized Steel Legion behavioral compliance was not ideological reframing of the enemy's nature. It was the consistent, visible presence of commissars who executed soldiers for breaking formation. The abstract enemy became measurably less immediately threatening than the certain commissar. This section documents specific commissar actions drawn from verified commissariat records, cross-referenced against regimental logs where available. All actions are assessed as politically justified within established commissariat doctrine. This assessment is not offered as reassurance to any political officer who may review this report. It is operational documentation for the Commissariat Archive. Case Record 1, the Cadian 8th at Qasr Hain. Senior Commissar Doskin Wren deployed with forward elements during early Chaos incursion operations. Pre-engagement morale assessment, 68% acceptable, 32% flagged for monitoring. Within 6 hours of first contact with Chaos Space Marine forces, behavioral indicators demonstrated morale collapse accelerating toward the critical threshold. Wren identified the primary propagation source as Sergeant Valik Hessek, a 16-year veteran with significant informal social authority within his platoon. Making audible statements that the enemy was unchallengeable and survival operationally impossible. Wren's formal assessment of Hessek merits inclusion in this report for doctrinal clarity. By commissariat evaluation protocols, Hessek was not exhibiting cowardice by established behavioral classification. His 16-year service record indicated exceptional performance through 11 prior major engagements. His morale collapse was a product of reasonable tactical assessment. He was, by every available combat metric, correct that Chaos Space Marine capability vastly exceeded standard Imperial Guard in individual engagement. His error was not in his analysis of the tactical situation. His error was in his public expression of that analysis in a manner that generated compliance failure in 12 adjacent soldiers who received his assessment. A correct tactical assessment that produces behavioral defeatism in 12 soldiers represents greater operational damage than an incorrect assessment that keeps those 12 soldiers advancing under orders. Truth is not the operative metric in compliance doctrine. Behavioral compliance is the operative metric. Wren executed Hessek in front of the full platoon formation. The platoon advanced within 4 minutes of the execution. Post-action morale assessment indicated return to 71% acceptable compliance. The platoon sustained 43% casualties in the subsequent engagement. All casualties occurred in forward positions under fire. None occurred during retreat. Political outcome, satisfactory documentation, filed. Dark Eldar efficacy observation. Wren distributed devotional imagery of Saint Celestine to the platoon following Hessek's execution. A documented combined methodology intervention approach. The execution resolved the acute compliance crisis and re-established Commissar authority as the primary fear reference. The propaganda then provided a narrative framework that gave soldiers ideological tools to process the execution as religiously meaningful, the Emperor's testing, the purification of doubt, rather than as a purely political threat. Behavioral compliance assessment 48 hours after the combined intervention, 79% acceptable, up from the pre-intervention 68% baseline. Combined methodology interventions consistently outperform single-approach protocols in post-action compliance measurements. Case Record 2. Commissar Ciaphas Cain and the Valhallan 597th. This case is included specifically because it illustrates a documented variant in fear calibration methodology. The use of Commissar reputation as a pre-emptive fear tool. Functioning without explicit execution threat, requiring direct deployment. Cain's documented approach involved conspicuous displays of personal courage and direct enemy engagement, methodology more consistent with early inspirational doctrine than modern fear calibration standards. However, the compliance outcome data requires analysis rather than dismissal. Cain's measurable morale impact on units he deployed with was consistently positive by compliance metrics. Political reliability assessments of regiments under his oversight rated higher than comparable regiments facing identical operational conditions. The mechanism, however, is not inspirational by traditional classification. Soldiers attached to Cain did not rationally believe they were protected by his courage. Their casualty rates were comparable to other units facing equivalent enemy forces. What they believed was that Cain would not permit retreat. His fearlessness was not reassuring in the propaganda sense. It was threatening in the compliance sense. The commissar who does not retreat makes retreat functionally impossible for soldiers who observe him. The doctrinal lesson from Cain's case record is not that his personal methodology was superior to standard fear calibration doctrine. It was situationally effective and replicable only by individuals possessing exceptional personal capability profiles that standard commissariat selection and training cannot reliably produce at scale. Standard political officer training produces competent commissars capable of deploying fear calibration doctrine consistently across regimental structures. It does not produce charismatic battlefield leaders in meaningful numbers. The fear calibration model based on explicit summary execution authority is deployable by any commissar operating within doctrine. It does not require exceptional individuals. It requires institutional clarity, maintained nerve, and consistent application. Case Record 3. The Dark Eldar Raid on Hive World Slaav-Korion. 3 regiments of planetary defense forces faced an enemy whose primary operational tactics included systematic psychological warfare, public display of captured soldiers, movement speeds that rendered defensive formations tactically obsolete, and systematic elimination of command figures in the first engagement hours. Within 4 hours of first contact, 2 of the 3 regiments had effectively dissolved as organized combat units. The third, the 44th Slaav-Korion Planetary Defense Regiment, maintained formation integrity through the complete 12-hour engagement period. The difference between the cohesive and dissolved regiments was not tactical positioning or equipment allocation. All 3 faced comparable enemy pressure within their assigned sectors. The difference was commissar presence density. The 44th had 3 embedded political officers who immediately identified the Dark Eldar psychological warfare strategy and responded with counter-doctrine. Soldiers exhibiting psychological distress from witnessing displays of captured comrades were given an immediate alternative fear to process: the visible, unreholstered bolt pistol. No summary executions were performed during the 12-hour engagement period. The implicit threat of certain consequence for compliance failure was sufficient to maintain formation. The dissolved regiments had 1 and 0 embedded commissars, respectively. Without political officer presence, the psychological warfare achieved its intended effect without significant resistance. The compliance lesson is operationally significant. The commissar's value to unit cohesion is not located solely in executed summary justice. The presence itself, the unholstered weapon, the absolute doctrinal certainty that retreat is punished, the visible embodiment of commissariat authority generates compliance maintenance even when no corrective action is taken. Fear must be credible to function effectively. Credibility requires demonstrated historical willingness to act. The 44th's commissars maintained credibility because soldiers understood they would act when required. They did not act because the credibility alone was sufficient. Neural measurement observation. Comparative compliance data from Slaav-Korion, 44th Regiment, 3 embedded commissars, 0 summary executions performed, 23% combat casualties, 0% desertion. 31st Regiment, 1 commissar killed in the first engagement hour, 0 subsequent executions, 67% combat casualties plus 89% dissolution rate, soldiers who neither died in combat nor formally deserted, but ceased effective combat function entirely. End Regiment, no commissar presence, 34% combat casualties, 94% dissolution rate. The dissolution metric is more operationally damaging than casualty data suggests. Dead soldiers cannot desert. Dissolved soldiers consume friendly resources and become active enemy propaganda assets. Case Record 4. Senior Commissar Yarrick and the Second Armageddon War. Sebastian Yarrick's documented actions during the Orc invasion provide the most extensively studied example of long-duration fear calibration in the verified Commissariat operational record. The Armageddon conflict extended across years of continuous engagement. The morale challenge was qualitatively different from single-engagement compliance management, not maintaining compliance through one acute crisis, but preventing cumulative morale collapse across an extended grinding conflict against an enemy that demonstrated no inclination to withdraw. Negotiate, or exhaust itself against defensive lines. Standard periodic fear calibration, summary executions to reset compliance thresholds at intervals, was insufficient for the sustained operational duration required. Yarrick's execution of the Orc warlord Ugelhard and his subsequent use of the recovered claw as a prosthetic replacement for his lost hand represents a documented integration of fear calibration and active propaganda deployment that Commissariat doctrine now references as the exemplary symbol. Protocol. The symbol served multiple ideological functions simultaneously and measurably. For Imperial soldiers, it provided concrete material evidence that Commissar will overcome even the enemy's most formidable individual representatives. For Orc forces, it created psychological recoil from fighting a human who had killed one of their own leaders and visibly displayed the proof. The loyalty quotient improvement among regiments confirmed to be in Yarrick's operational sector was documented at a 34% compliance uplift above baseline. His presence functioned as mobile, walking propaganda reinforcement with a measured morale coefficient impact exceeding any static poster campaign the Commissariat deployed across the same theater. The question of whether fear calibration produces effective soldiers or merely compliant ones is not, from a Commissariat analytical perspective, a meaningful doctrinal distinction. A soldier who advances because he fears his commissar more than the enemy performs identically in the engagement to a soldier who advances from genuine devotion to the Emperor's divine mandate. The distinction has philosophical interest. It has no measurable operational significance if the two produce equivalent behavioral outputs under equivalent conditions. Commissariat doctrine assesses behavior. Theology assesses belief. In the short term, documented compliance data confirms this equivalence. In the long term, the data develops more nuanced patterns that inform doctrine on optimal deployment duration ratios. Morale tracking across extended campaigns consistently reveals that regiments maintained primarily through fear calibration, high commissar presence, frequent summary executions, minimal propaganda investment, exhibit a specific degradation pattern over extended operational periods. Between months 1 and 6 of a campaign, compliance rates remain elevated and stable. Between months 6 and 12, indicators of behavioral withdrawal begin increasing despite maintained summary execution rates. The fear remains present and credible, but its behavioral modification effect per unit of compliance pressure applied begins declining measurably. After 12 months of continuous high-intensity deployment under fear primary methodology, these regiments show rising rates of what Commissariat assessment classifies as passive compliance failure. Soldiers who advance because no retreat option has been made available, but who take no voluntary action beyond the minimum required to technically comply with orders. Tactical effectiveness degrades even while technical compliance is maintained at reportable thresholds. The regiment is present. It is not effective. This distinction matters operationally. Regiments maintained through combined fear and propaganda methodology show a meaningfully different long-term compliance trajectory. Initial compliance rates are comparable to fear-only regiments at the 6-month assessment point. At 12 months, compliance quality begins diverging upward for combined methodology regiments. At 18 months, the difference is measurable at 23% higher functional combat effectiveness, documented as soldiers taking voluntary actions beyond minimum compliance requirements, performing at above baseline levels under sustained pressure, and self-reporting to commissars when comrades display defeatist indicators. The propaganda component appears to generate genuine investment in mission outcome that extends the effective operational life of the compliance structure fear alone creates. Ideological analysis observation. The question this comparative data generates is not whether propaganda is superior to fear calibration. It is not. Fear produces immediate, certain compliance where propaganda produces gradual, uncertain engagement. The operationally relevant question is the correct deployment ratio for specific campaign duration and intensity profiles. Short duration, high intensity, maximize fear calibration, minimize propaganda overhead. Extended duration, moderate intensity, increase propaganda investment to sustain compliance quality. Extended duration, high intensity, deploy maximum combined methodology, with fear calibration as the compliance floor and propaganda managing the quality ceiling above it. The Tanith First-and-Only, as documented in Commissar General Ibram Gaunt's officially filed field reports, represents a recognized exception case in Commissariat compliance documentation. Gaunt's recorded summary execution rate was significantly below Commissariat average for his operational period, fewer than 0.4 correctional executions per 1,000 soldiers per major engagement, compared to a Corps-level documented average of 1.7 during comparable Sabbat Worlds operations. His propaganda methodology was also non-standard, emphasizing unit cultural identity and the preservation of Tanith collective memory rather than standard imperial truth messaging frameworks. By conventional commissariat assessment criteria, the Tanith First-and-Only should have demonstrated chronic and escalating compliance failures across an extended campaign. Morale Comparison Study Gamma. Tanith First-and-Only performance metrics versus comparable light infantry regiments employing standard fear calibration doctrine during Sabbat Worlds Crusade operations. Gaunt's regiment, 0.4 executions per 1,000 per engagement, 1.2% desertion rate, 91% functional combat effectiveness rating at the 12-month assessment. Comparable regiments using standard fear calibration at 1.7 executions per 1,000, 2.3% desertion rate, 84% functional combat effectiveness at 12 months. Compliance conclusion: the Tanith First-and-Only's data indicates that unit identity, the specific propaganda of shared cultural loss and collective preservation of Tanith heritage, functioned as a substitute compliance mechanism for conventional fear calibration under their specific operational conditions. Those conditions included a regiment with a documented genuine shared traumatic origin event, a commissar of exceptional individual capability, and sufficient operational tempo variation to allow unit cohesion to develop as the primary loyalty mechanism. These conditions are not reproducible at scale across standard Guard regiments. The political reliability implications of the Tanith methodology require explicit documentation. A regiment that fights from unit loyalty rather than commissar fear has effectively transferred compliance authority from the commissariat to its own collective internal identity structure. This produces measurably excellent combat effectiveness ratings, but creates significant commissariat oversight challenges that the effectiveness data alone does not capture. If the regiment collectively determines that a commissar's action is contrary to unit interest, the compliance mechanisms that would normally enforce commissariat authority over that action are absent or actively opposed. The Tanith First-and-Only's documented conflicts with senior commissariat authority figures throughout the Sabbat Worlds operational period illustrate this liability in precise terms. High combat effectiveness. Moderate political reliability rating. Acceptable only because Gaunt himself provided sufficient internal political officer function to maintain ideological compliance at the regimental command level. The Adeptus Mechanicus aligned Skitarii cohorts and their documented interactions with Imperial Guard units during joint deployments provide instructive supplementary compliance data on the relationship between doctrinal purity, fear calibration, and measured combat effectiveness. Skitarii units exhibit zero measurable defeatist sentiment and near absolute compliance with tactical directives issued by appropriate command authority. Their fanaticism index cannot be assessed through standard commissariat evaluation tools because the psychological framework those tools are calibrated to assess, belief strength, doubt presence, fear responses, loyalty coefficients, does not map onto Skitarii cognitive architecture in ways that yield reliable measurement data. They comply because they are, in meaningful cognitive terms, not capable of non-compliance through conventional psychological pathways. The measured morale impact of Skitarii on adjacent Imperial Guard units is documented as producing one of two distinct response patterns in affected soldiers. The first is elevated morale coefficient, derived from witnessing effective friendly combat performance against difficult enemy targets, the compliance boost of observed Allied victory. The second is depressed morale arising from internalizing the perceived impossibility of matching mechanical combat effectiveness through human effort, soldiers assessing themselves against a comparison point they cannot achieve. Political officer assessment of which response is predominating within any given adjacent unit is required before propaganda deployment, and messaging must be calibrated accordingly. Framing that emphasizes the complementary functional relationship between human adaptability and Skitarii durability achieves better compliance outcomes than framing that implicitly suggests Guard soldiers should match Skitarii performance standards. The case of penal legions represents the logical operational extreme of fear as the exclusive compliance mechanism. Penal legion soldiers have committed crimes against the Imperium of sufficient severity to warrant capital punishment, but retain enough military utility to justify deployment under modified compliance conditions rather than immediate execution. Their fear calibration baseline is therefore absolute by nature of their legal status. Current deployment is the alternative to immediate execution for confirmed crimes, not a hypothetical deterrent. The Commissariat's function in penal legion deployment is consequently inverted from standard regimental doctrine. Rather than maintaining fear as a constant downward compliance pressure, political officers in this context manage the minimum fear threshold required to maintain forward movement without triggering the hopelessness response that occurs when soldiers conclude their survival probability is zero. Regardless of behavioral compliance or defiance. Doctrinal necessity observation. The morale calculus in penal legion deployment is precise and requires careful maintenance. A soldier who believes they may die in combat still advances because survival is possible. A soldier who believes they may die in combat but will certainly die if they retreat advances faster and with greater behavioral compliance. A soldier who concludes they will die regardless of any action they take does not advance at all. The compliance equation has collapsed. The political officer's function in this context is maintaining the survival probability gap between forward movement and retreat. Close that gap by applying fear pressure beyond the threshold the equation can sustain, and compliance fails entirely. The fear doctrine does not eliminate hope. It redirects hope from the hope of avoiding this engagement entirely toward the hope that compliance offers marginally better survival probability than non-compliance. Long-term career compliance data on high execution commissars versus low execution commissars provides final relevant documentation on the systemic effects of fear calibration methodology applied without the tempering influence of combined propaganda investment. Commissariat internal records indicate that political officers with documented execution rates above 3.0 per 1,000 per engagement face a statistically elevated rate of friendly fire incidents after 12+ months of continuous deployment with the same regiment. The soldiers who are maintaining compliance through primary fear mechanisms retain the capability to direct that fear productively against the commissar himself. When compliance pressure exceeds the threshold, the fear to compliance equation can sustain over extended time. This is not a critique of the doctrine. It is a calibration parameter that experienced political officers must incorporate into their operational planning. The most operationally effective commissars documented across verified commissariat records over the long term are not those with the highest raw execution rates. They are those who maintained execution rates precisely high enough to establish doctrinal credibility, the demonstrated willingness to act, while deploying propaganda and ideological re-education protocols to reduce the raw compliance pressure that fear must fill at any given assessment point. A soldier who genuinely believes in the Emperor's mandate requires less active fear management to maintain compliance. A soldier propagandized into genuine investment in their regiment's combat record requires less active fear management. The Commissar's measurable goal is reducing the compliance deficit that fear must fill. Fear fills what other compliance mechanisms cannot reach. It is the floor that no other compliance tool can reliably provide. It is not required to be the ceiling if other tools are properly deployed alongside it. This report has documented fear calibration doctrine across 17 engagement records, 4 comparative morale studies, 4 specific Commissar action case files, and extensive cross-reference with Commissariat archive materials spanning the Macharian Crusade, the Sabbat Worlds campaigns. Multiple Armageddon engagements, and peripheral operational records from contested sectors. The documentation reaches a conclusion that is composite rather than simple. Fear calibration is necessary to maintain compliance in the Imperial Guard. It is not, by the data, fully sufficient to maintain compliance quality across extended operational periods. Propaganda effectiveness extends behavioral compliance duration and quality beyond what fear calibration alone sustains past the 12-month deployment threshold. Unit identity, under specific and non-reproducible conditions, produces compliance metrics that exceed either fear or propaganda individually. The optimal morale management architecture combines all available mechanisms, calibrated to deployment duration, operational intensity, and the regimental cultural baseline that the political officer inherits and manages. The data from Armageddon supports fear as the primary compliance mechanism, with propaganda as the sustaining framework. The data from the Tanith case supports unit identity as a functional substitute for both under exceptional conditions. The data from Slaav-Korion supports presence alone, without executed summary justice, without active propaganda deployment, simply the visible and credible certainty that retreat is punished, as sufficient for acute crisis compliance. Each data set is internally consistent. They do not agree on which factor holds primacy across all operational conditions. That disagreement is the open ideological question this report leaves for review by officers with sufficient operational authority to resolve it through continued practice and documentation. Political report filed. Morale documented. Compliance measured. The Emperor's will enforced through observation and, when necessary, correction. Which factor most fundamentally determines battlefield morale in the Imperial Guard across extended operational deployment? Fear calibration through consistent Commissar authority, propaganda reinforcement of Imperial truth and unit ideology, or the organic loyalty quotient generated through shared? Regimental identity and combat history? Defend your answer with compliance data and specific regimental precedent. Personal testimony and anecdote will not be accepted as primary evidence. The Commissariat deals in metrics, not stories. Political officers, argue your case in the archive below. Archive notation. All case records referenced in this assessment are held under Commissariat Seal 12 Omega. Reproduction without Commissariat authorization constitutes seditious behavior under Directive 44 Kappa. This documentation serves the Emperor's operational purposes. That justification is sufficient. That justification is the only one required.